Okay, thank you everyone for joining today at the University of Texas Energy Institute's Energy Symposium here for January 23rd, 2020, or January 31st, 2023. Before I introduce our speaker for today more formally, I will point out the talks for the next upcoming weeks. Next week, we will have William Rees, Professor Emeritus from the University of British Columbia. We'll talk about energy and the impact of incipient shortages on cities and urbanization. And then the following week, we'll have perhaps a little more technical talk on high temperature polymer electrolytes and fuel cells and hydrogen by Christopher Argus, professor at Penn State University. But today, it is our pleasure to have with us today Rob Threlkeld. He's the Director of Global Energy Strategy for General Motors. So interesting to have someone here who's in charge of the energy consumption strategy and long-term strategy for a major auto manufacturer. He's going to talk to us today about General Motors' path to zero emissions and a holistic viewpoint of that. So just a slight background on Rob. He's the Director of Global Energy Strategy for General Motors, leading their efforts that range from renewables procurement, clean technology, and policy efforts related to grid decarbonization. This includes a commitment that he will discuss to meet electricity of its global operations with 100% renewable energy by 2035. And he's responsible for leading the team that reviews and integrates the decarbonization of their technologies, including battery storage, behind-the-meter applications, and electric vehicles. He has a bachelor's degree and master's in civil engineering from Purdue and a certified hazardous material manager and a certified energy manager and business energy professional. So today he's going to highlight some of the GM strategy, including their 4-pillar effort to tackling zero emissions vehicles and their plan for 100% renewable energy across their global operations. And with that being said, I will now stop sharing and turn it over to Rob. And as always, I will point out to everyone, please submit your questions via the question and answer feature of chat or online on YouTube, and I will seek to answer these or ask these to Rob when he is done speaking. So with that said, Rob, go ahead and share your screen and talk away.
All right. Can you hear me okay, Carrie?
It sounds fine. Sounds good.
All right. Well, I jumped ahead of myself here a little bit on the screens, it looks like. Anyway, so thanks for the nice introduction. I do have a nice background. I am a person who loves both palm trees and water. So as you can imagine, I live in Michigan, and I also like to be in Florida as well, being around water, whether it's Great Lakes and or the Gulf of Mexico or the ocean. Somebody who's grown up around water most of his life. Anyway, as nicely introduced by Carrie, I do lead our broader global energy strategy and procurement teams at General Motors. You know, we procure on the magnitude of somewhere around $750 million worth of energy on an annualized basis, and actually are the team that actually leads the direct procurement of those activities. So whereas maybe you would come across a number of companies that have a purchasing team that does that, I have a team that actually works for me that incorporates all of that. So we live through the issues and challenges that we have when it comes to procuring the energy and the reliability issues associated with that when there are shortages as well. And we work across our entire manufacturing footprint and manufacturing operations to ensure that we're successful in doing that. A little bit of background of General Motors. You know, we are committed to the safety in everything we do. So as we think about both manufacturing and the communities that we manufacture our products in, as well as the services that we provide. You know, we really are here to earn customers for life as we build the brands that inspire passion, you know, and loyalty around those. Going back to the days as you think about some of the early vehicles we built, to the OnStar systems that are some of the life safety things, to where we are going today as we move down the path to an all-electric future. We translate basically breakthrough technologies into the vehicles that people experience, you know, and first and foremost, and kind of what's near and dear to my heart, you know, as we create the sustainable solutions that improve the communities for which we live and work. A little background on me is how I actually grew into this, you know, interest into this field. And if you read some of the stuff that is online, But my early days of looking at environmental concerns and issues around, because I love maple syrup, were around maple syrup production. In the 80s, there was a lot of talk about acid rain and the impacts to some of the syrup farms and maple syrup trees in the forests in the Northeast United States and parts of Canada and Quebec. And that's really what inspired me to get into the field that I am ultimately today in the areas of environmental, civil, / into the sustainability and energy space. At General Motors, we are here basically focused around our 000 mission, which is zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. And our people are really the driving force around making this a reality. And a lot of what I'll talk about today obviously focuses on that initial one right in the center part, which is zero emissions. I'll talk a lot about our facilities, but I'll also tie into some of the other things that you may or may not know that General Motors is engaged in. As we go down the path towards a zero emissions future that is much more, frankly, beyond the manufacturing footprint that I deal with on a day-to-day basis and some of the strategies associated with the company. As we look at our goals and aspirations and ambitions, we have a goal to become carbon neutral in our global products and operations by 2040. We aspire to eliminate tailpipe emissions from all of our light-duty vehicles by 2035, which really means we're transitioning to EVs on a very significant basis and investing about $35 billion into that. And we root our ambition into science by setting science-based targets to track our progress. So we have set a science-based target around our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 as it relates to our products, and which is obviously our vehicles as we move forward into the future. And not only that, I will highlight there are other goals that we've obviously established too beyond the zero emissions component of that, which is reducing our operational intensity, both of water and of energy and water, striving to get at least 50% sustainable material content into our vehicles by 2050, achieving about 90%, if not more, waste diversion from our landfills incineration globally by 2035. And not only from a GM perspective, but then leading into the space of working with our tier 1 suppliers and developing a GM supplier sustainability program. And that really is, I would say, industry-wide, because many of the same tier 1 suppliers that supply GM also supply a lot of the other automotive industry as well. And so I think it's really moving the entire industry forward as we think about sustainability as a whole. And then, as you can imagine, making packaging 100% returnable and or made majority from sustainable content and zero waste by 2030, because there's a lot that goes into obviously making of the automobile itself. I'll get a little bit into the procurement and reliability aspect of the part of the team that I manage that actually spends the bulk of their time in this space. And then I'll get into a little bit also on the energy strategy side and other parts of the business as we go down that path. But give you a little bit about the procurement. It's really about buying better, investing smarter, and as we spend better, respond smarter to the markets. And we've got a lot of tools, as you can see on this, and they're very circular. The arrow goes round and round for a reason. We do the direct energy procurement and sustainability commitments. We do advocacy and policy. We work with our utilities and commissioners around rates, our purchase agreements for renewables and procurement, carbon reduction efforts. But we got to rely on data to inform the decision-making processes as we talk to our utilities, as we put out requests for proposals for energy for our facilities. And so we've got a system called GM2100, Energy OnStar, Edison, and we've got companies like Edison Energy that we've hired advisors for. And we've got various energy dashboards that funnel in a lot of our information that what of our global operations are doing and what each facility is doing real time to help us inform the decision-making process as we source utilities for our facilities. And we've got various processes within our own facilities that, one, reduce consumption, understanding how and where we use energy, called energy treasure hunts. We have energy conservation engineers at a number of our facilities. We engage across a number of non-government organizations. We have 50,000 ready. As we think about our central utility complexes, which are our largest energy users, how do we reduce all of those? Those filter into how do we set sustainability targets, which includes being 100% renewable in the US by 2025, globally by 2035. I mentioned some of our other science-based targets, water intensity, funnels into our public and investor reporting as more and more investors and stakeholders are interested in what companies like GM are doing in this space, whether it's reporting through CDP, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, Re100, our fleet customer inquiries, et cetera, EPA Green Power Partnership. This is all really integrated into the GM, what I would call Sustainable Workplaces Integrated Energy Program. And as I mentioned, it is a continuing circle. As we do each one of these feeds into the other, we improve upon it, drive energy out of the equation, drive more green energy into the equation, optimize our processes and equipment in order to be able to continue to do that. So these systems are all kind of critical on a procurement side. Then on the reliability side, this is a chart I'm sure all of us are extremely aware, especially coming into Winter Storm Erie and the impact we're seeing today, even with the ice storms. Hopefully it's minimal as we go forward, what we're seeing today, in Texas and other states as well. But, climate extreme events and droughts are increasing significantly, and that has an impact on our own facilities. As we look at reliability and how do we address some of these intermittencies and concerns around demand and supply and reliability of our facilities, and how do we build our facilities for the future and how to react to concerns that might be raised as a result of supply. So this is just a chart to show that on the procurement and reliability side, we work quite closely with our facilities when it comes to supply and the decision-making processes that go into when we may shut down facilities at time to time, given the limited supply that might be available, whether it's natural gas, water, sewer, or electricity. As I get into the renewable energy and energy strategy side of the team that I lead, it really is focused around our carbon footprint. This gives you an idea of GM's carbon footprint as it relates to both our manufacturing, and as you can probably imagine, most of it's related to the use of our sold products, which in this case is obviously our ICE vehicles, internal combustion vehicles. But as we transition to becoming an all-electric manufacturer of EVs going forward into the future, you can see it's going to have a significant impact on the broader carbon footprint of our products and of our company's footprint as a whole. And that does kind of funnel into the policy and advocacy work that the 2% does start to build into. So you can imagine that we do advocate quite strongly when it comes to integrated resource plans and decarbonization of utilities. It may have a small impact as we get our facilities to 100% renewable electricity, but it has a big impact as we think about our electric vehicle efforts as a company, as we work into that space, building out the EVs that we're going to be building, and impacts on the supply chain. So we do want everyone to have the ability to access, clean energy going forward. That has to be cost-effective, reliable, resilient, secure, and ultimately decarbonizing at the same time. So you can see just a little bit of a footprint based on a levelized cost analysis of what our carbon footprint is. So we plan on achieving our carbon neutral commitment, as I kind of said, a holistic view of things. It's putting a lot of focus on decarbonizing our portfolio by shifting to EVs or other zero emission vehicle technology. We have been building fuel cell technology going back into the 50s in the Electrovan. If you may, obviously, if you've studied anything, you've seen that GM's fuel cell operations, and at that point in time, were much more significant. We still have a fuel cell operations that we are working with. In fact, we recently announced several other partnerships, and I'll get into a few of those, working across a number of value streams in the transportation sector. By the end of 2025, we'll have introduced about 30 all-electric models globally that will make about 40% of our US models battery electric. We're investing about $35 billion into electric and autonomous vehicle programs. You may have heard of Cruise, which is coming to Austin, to Denver and to others, Cruise autonomous vehicle programs. And the biggest area that I have an impact on as it relates directly is the sourcing of 100% renewable electricity to power our facilities by 2025 and our global sites by 2035. I will say we recently did just announce and signing 2 large-scale power purchase agreements for some of our facilities in the Midwest, primarily in Michigan. We have achieved that goal and secured enough load to get 100% of our global, or I should say our US operations to that goal by the 2025 time period. Because it does take time once you sign a deal for these facilities to be built. One of the things that we've always looked at, and probably heard the term additionality. So we're basically building and ensuring that new additional renewable energy resources are coming to the grid that are supporting our facilities, and ultimately decarbonizing the grid as we go forward. GM's renewable energy strategy, and it was noted in Carrie's kind of overview of an introduction, is really focused on 4 pillars. And it's across a number of areas that we obviously have a strong influence around our manufacturing sites. We have a whole team that's focused on energy efficiency efforts, obviously reducing our consumption of our facilities during the times that we're not producing, but even more importantly, optimizing it when we're running our manufacturing sites. The team that I lead directly is in the area of sourcing renewables, so direct investments. We have some large-scale landfill gas generation projects and some solar on our facilities. We've established some green tariffs working in regulated states with our public utilities, investor-owned utilities, and when we've done a significant number of power purchase agreements. In fact, our Arlington, Texas facility, which is one of our largest facilities on a global basis, that produces the Tahoes, Suburban, and the Escalades, is 100% powered by wind energy. That is from 2 wind farms in Texas, one in the south, one in the north. And partially, you might think too, you could do all of it in one large scale. It's more like you do when you make your investments. Our renewable energy strategy is to find projects and renewable energy assets that are within the footprint of our manufacturing sites. So in this case, we diversified across 2 wind farms. We've got about 16 assets that are generating right now about 3.5, well, will be when 2025 is here, generating about 3.5 terawatt hours of electricity, which is what our North America operations consume. Looking at the intermittency side of the equation, we bring all these intermittent resources like wind and solar, to the grid. How can our assets, products, and services, i.e. think about electric vehicles, battery storage, and other assets, address the intermittency? And really what you're doing is you're bringing load and matching it with your intermittent resources. And so storage will become a big component of that. And then public policy and our advocacy. As we work to drive down the costs and increase the renewable energy opportunities across the country, does require, leveraging the scale of the company, either as an individual as we advocate for, efforts and change, or within organizations like the Clean Energy Buyers Association, which is really a new organization that's been around now for about 3 years, formerly known as the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. Both of those in context have been around for about 3 years. It's the buyer's voice. Corporations like General Motors, and it's now about 300 members or so of companies and developers that are really working together to figure out ways to scale up renewables. And more to come on the Clean Energy Buyers Association, but you can definitely go to the CE Buyers, cleanenergybuyers.org website, and you'll be able to see a lot of the companies and efforts that we're doing to really work on scaling renewables as well as broader decarbonization technology as a whole that will support everyone. So it's not just bringing, I can look at it this way. If GM became 100% renewable tomorrow, but no one else did, were you really successful? It's really about the transition that has to occur to get everyone the ability to decarbonize as we work to address the impacts of climate extreme events and climate change. This gives you a little summary of the, some of the impacts as we think about it from a supply and renewable energy strategy. More and more companies are setting commitments. The U.S. renewable energy, projects have dropped a little bit, about 30% in Q2. You do have some market saturation. We have transmission constraints and that impacts price. We've got issues in interconnect queues. We've got growing electricity demand. You have growing U.S. liquefied natural gas markets. As you can imagine, although this is a little bit outdated to a degree, but at one point in time, you had $10 per MCF gas, and in Europe, it was 70, 7 times price differential. There's a lot of things that go into the markets now that are driving a lot of the decision-making processes that corporations like GM are looking at, as we end up trying to source, as I look at the procurement side of the equation and ultimately on the renewable side of the equation, hand in hand, hence the team that I lead. We work quite closely together to ensure that we're successful, but also then working with our policy teams to understand the impacts that are brought on by market saturation renewables in one area. How do we get that renewable that's low cost to other markets that may have higher cost electricity? And in the end, it's all about cost, reliability, resiliency, and security, followed by decarbonization. How do we address that? And how do we think about it as we, grow the portfolio of renewable energy assets at the same time, put the focus on electrification of the transportation sector? This gives you an idea, as I mentioned earlier, 16 or 17, roughly 16 renewable energy projects that are across our global footprint. You can imagine that, most of our footprint is in the Midwest, as well as in Texas. And so you can see the number of renewable energy assets that we've now got under contract and under long-term, as well as some on-site solar and on-site renewables that we've got that support our facilities. And this includes, as I said, solar, wind, landfill gas across 5 regional transmission operations that serve our manufacturing sites' electricity demands. And as I mentioned back in October, we did achieve our renewable energy goal for the U.S. Interestingly enough, when we established the Re100 goal in 2016, we made a commitment to get all of our global operations 100% renewable by 2050. You can see how quickly the dynamics of the markets are really changing, that we accelerated that goal a full 25 years. In fact, I've had a couple of employees approach me in the company to say, wow, you skipped an entire generation. And if you really think about it, this is how quickly the things are really changing in the energy and transportation landscape. It's an exciting time to be in a company like General Motors, to see how quickly we're changing as a company, but how quickly we're creating the services that are also supporting customers to have more choice. And if you think about the efforts into the future and around electric vehicles, these are the components that are critically important for us to actually meet. The other areas that we're getting into is around carbon tracking and collaboration. You've got to understand and analyze in data, what's going into, the generation that's going into the grid. And so we're part of a coalition around real-time carbon tracking to understand, sometimes that electron is greener than other times of the day. And so how do we actually start to track those efforts as the decision makings that we make around both our procurement of renewables, our operations of our facilities, and as we think about the integration of storage and other assets going forward into the future, how do we appropriately attract for that carbon that's being, created by fossil generation and being somewhat offset by the renewable energy generation as we go. So some of the things that we're, working with, we actually encourage PJM, which is one of the largest market operators of the grid in the eastern United States, across about 13 states and markets, or I should say 13 states. They're now publishing a carbon signal down to the hub level that actually, and no level that actually shows, no different than price, because markets actually operate on price. They can actually publish a signal around carbon. It helps companies like GM figure out ways to help source and do things accordingly so that we can plan our energy use going forward. As I mentioned, next generation carbon accounting is here. You're going to see some of this, whether it's through the Clean Energy Buyers Association, as I mentioned, the Emissions First Coalition, and some of these other efforts that are out there. There's really two approaches. No approach is wrong. One's a little bit better than the other, but they all start to refine and match what the markets are doing when it relates to electricity consumption. So you have the 24/7 that you might have heard, and the emissionality. Both start to get down to the granular level of what that carbon footprint is on an hourly basis and or real time as it looks from an emissionality perspective. And a lot of that's due to how fast the markets are changing. As we know, one renewable energy credit is equal to 1 megawatt hour of electricity, but that 1 megawatt hour of electricity, as I noted, is different shades of green depending on what part of the market and what time of the day that electron is generated. And so it's really starting to refine the methods that go into the procurement process so that we can understand what our true carbon footprint is as we make the decisions going forward, and ultimately help decarbonize the grid. The other area that we've been focusing a lot on as I think about this kind of holistic story, and this was just recently announced, as well as the Virtual Power Plant Initiative with the Rocky Mountain Institute. It's really starting to think about all these assets that are coming to the grid from the distributed energy resources. And how do we start to aggregate up all of these signals in a way that actually provides value to the customer? VPPs represent hundreds of gigawatts of market potential that are literally just sitting on the grid to help help us get to low carbon, low cost. They're low cost and help us decarbonize at the same time. But the biggest challenge really is around three market barriers. It's around market policies, about how they actually articulate, the value of these. As I mentioned to the second part, what is the retail value of this? And stakeholder awareness. A lot of folks don't understand that, we're accustomed to driving down the street and seeing that a gallon of gas is a few cents cheaper. I'm going to stop at that gas station. But what we don't really realize is that our electricity rates vary significantly over the course of the day. You can actually charge your electric vehicle for significantly less, or you can run appliances or cool your home down for significantly less and not run these things and not charge these things during certain parts of the day when you have some of the highest electricity costs. As an example, in the state of Michigan, I do live there. DT just came out with a new rate that basically said between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. from mid-March to mid-September, your electricity rates are going to be 30% higher. Well, if I cool my house, pre-cool the house, and by 3 o'clock don't have the air conditioner run for 3-4 hours, I should say, you significantly save a lot of electricity. And then you're not really losing a lot of your comfort cooling in that aspect. So it's really about raising stakeholder awareness, public utility commissioners, and everyone that, in this distributed energy grid of the future, you're going to have a lot more control over your costs and potentially see a lot more value as we scale up EVs and we think about the efforts of vehicle to grid applications going forward. One of the other things that, as we think about grid decarbonization and some of the things that we're leveraging within General Motors, we have a GM Ventures arm. We have worked, and I work closely with GM Ventures to invest into a wind catching system, which is a novel. You can get a picture of it here. It's a large structure, but it really fits in a much smaller footprint. So when you start to think about the amount of land square footage, whether it's on land or in the ocean, that's needed to help decarbonize, it's finding the technologies that are out there that help enable us to continue to decarbonize, but use more efficient usage of acreage, fewer units, and ultimately thinking about it in the essence of the overall lower levelized cost of electricity. And where can we drive some of the synergies? As we think about GM Ventures and other companies that have venture capital arms too, it's about leveraging the strengths that we bring as a company as it relates to starting to scale some of these newer technologies. We have a massive supply chain. We have massive engineering and testing capabilities. We have a large growth of markets and renewable, not just in the US. And we have the ability to advocate in policy and link them together with other aspects on a global basis, the size of General Motors. So this is some of the neat things as we think about it from a broader GM Ventures and really leveraging the company as I relate back to that fourth pillar, scale, in order for us to actually drive some of these technologies to market. I mentioned GM Energy. You may have seen this in the news. It was recently announced in October of last year. So you can think about GM as a car company, which is primarily still what we are today. But as we transition to an all-electric future, producing all these EVs, these EVs become another asset. You really can't take gas out of the gas tank. Yes, you can. It's not safe. It's not something that's really economical for anyone to do, and there's no market there. But as you think about the EV as an asset going forward and tied back to our virtual power plant partnership, you have an ability to utilize this asset in a way that really starts to drive value to the customer. And this is really where the GM Energy side of it comes in. It's taking the whole products and services side. Think about OnStar as a safety system and security, from your vehicle and crash response and other things that it tracks as far as how you operate the vehicle. Think of OnStar as another way to actually provide safety and security within your home. You can actually run your home for a significant amount of time and days, actually, when the power goes out with your electric vehicle. And so GM Energy is a holistic area that's really thinking about how do we leverage that asset in a way that provides value to the customer. Once again, not only is that vehicle now something that you utilize to get from point A to point B and back to point A, it's also now an asset that you can utilize in ways that aggregate up and have access to the market and provide other solutions. And really, it's taking all these, as I said, old world to demand responses today to distributed energy resources of the future. The vehicle grid or the virtual power plant partnership and all of these are key components to be able to do that. Because in the end, the grid is most optimized when you're filling in the troughs and the peaks. And this is a chart that I got with from Consumers Energy in Michigan, as we work with them on their integrated resource plan, but they're really looking at peak reduction where they build these additional assets or buy power at an extreme high cost. And trying to really operate in the yellow line. And it's doing it in a way that's most efficient from a grid perspective and most efficient from a cost perspective. So what is GM Energy? It's really an ecosystem that's reimagined. It's designing integrated energy solutions that change the energy as we know it. The Ultium technology, as I mentioned, it's introducing, the charging networks, the dedicated backup home power, and a suite of other products and services that help really drive a more resilient grid. Because in the end, all of these assets acting together as one drive resiliency and drive out cost as we think about an all-electric future from a GM perspective, but as we think about transitioning to an all-electric future around everything we do from our livelihoods perspective as well. And like I said, it's a very interesting space to really be in right now when you think about the standard utility and the standard automotive hasn't really changed. You've had big central plants around utility, and you had the internal combustion engine around that. It all both improved efficiencies as iterations came, but now we're moving to a future that's really going to be around the electric grid and around EVs and how that electron is generated at what time of day, and then ultimately how it is consumed and potentially fed back depending on how the systems are operating. In the GM Energy space, we've got Ultium Charge 360, which is going to be focused on the charging aspect. You got Ultium Home, which is going to be focused around the aspect at the home part, which is really your vehicle to grid applications, and Ultium's Commercial, which is going to be focused a lot on the utility scale aspects associated with that. As I mentioned earlier, this kind of fits right in perfectly to pillar number 3, which is addressing the intermittency component as it relates to scaling up renewables on the grid and other distributed energy resources based on how you charge your electric vehicle, when you charge your electric vehicle, potentially when you discharge your electric vehicle, and utilize large scale storage and some of the other applications. And this gives you an idea. It's, it's all sorts of things as it builds into the hardware solutions and integrated software platforms and really one-stop shopping. And as I mentioned, this is case study. There's a couple utilities that are being worked on right now, Pacific Gas and Electric, that are piloting, some of this cutting edge technology to understand how these, they go back to the virtual power plant partnership, how do markets actually value these? How do utilities look at retail offerings, and how do we actually raise the awareness that this can become an asset to all of us going forward into the future? And I noted on a little bit earlier, expanding electrification. There's work that we're doing with Textron and others in the aerospace sector. We're working with Lab Tech, in the fuel cell area around rail, and alternative energy technology, watercraft and pure watercraft, working on in the marine spaces. We think electrification. Big part of, you may have heard BrightDrop, which is our electric vans. And we've worked with a number of companies now that are looking at the electric vans, as you can imagine. So we saw around Christmas, there's tons of delivery trucks delivering, gifts and delivering other aspects, all the time on the streets. And can we electrify that in ways that drive additional value to the fleet customers? And then an aftermarket, as we think about some of the other changes that we're doing in our space around, e-crate, maybe converting your ICE vehicle to EVs if you want to utilize that EV in the aftermarket space. So we're really focused a lot beyond just the EV itself, across a number of value streams in the transportation sector. But this is the part that I find most exciting, is because we are creating the solutions that, one, I have a lot of passion around the electricity space, but that we're creating the solutions that have a lot of impact on the livelihood or on the lives that we see on a daily basis, from delivery to transportation to potentially how we power our home. One of the other areas I want to kind of highlight is, if you do go to one of our GM facilities, is starting to kind of, the whole big question out there is electric vehicle charging, the reliability and everything else. But similar questions get raised even at the employee level. And we're working across our whole workplaces, a number of our facilities around a workplace charging effort that's going to have common, consistent branding. We want to make sure the customer experience in the case of our facilities right now will be free. I can't say that's going to be the case when you look offsite at General Motors facilities, but we're trying to get that customer experience when it comes to the easiness and the consistency of the experience, that the reliability is there, that the chargers keep up with our vehicle portfolio as we transition the portfolio, and they're easily maintainable. I mean, these are all the key things that I think, as we look at beyond even just General Motors, that we need to ensure as we transition to an all-electric future for the transportation sector, that we make sure that the customer experience is consistent. And that's going to be the critical component, that they can rely on the fact that charger is working, no different than when you drive up to the gas station today. Because we all know when you drive up to the pump, you stop your car and you get out there and you see that the gas pump is actually marked off, you get annoyed. And so, I mean, it's similar types of experiences that we want to drive through from a perspective of an industry-wide component too. I'm not going to read this slide. This just highlights some of our ESG commitments. But like I said last year, the key thing that I want to point out, we did meet our renewable energy goal in the US by 2025, a full 25 years ahead of the goal. We did make the GM Ventures wing catching systems effort. We're working with them on that. And just some of the other goals, 2022 EPA Energy Star Partner of the Year. We keep focused on driving energy out of the operations. As I mentioned, that is the lowest cost option for us when it comes to the efforts that we can do. Is that electron that isn't consumed is the cheapest electron that we can have going forward. And just some of the other efforts that we've been doing in this space. And I think one of the other last thing I'll kind of leave you here is we do have the Climate Equity Fund that we're investing into various nonprofits that are working within the communities to decarbonize, as well as educate, and to think about how we can utilize some of this charging infrastructure as we go forward as a company on our path to zero emissions. And I guess really with that, those are the question or the end of the presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Rob. You have attracted a decent number of questions here, so see how many we can get through. So thank you, everyone attending, for submitting the questions. I guess I'll just go in order they were submitted. This one's one maybe you didn't. Well, I think you maybe mentioned this brand, but product within GM, does GM plan to use green hydrogen within its facilities worldwide or anywhere? And how does this relate to, I guess what they're referring to here is hydrotech fuel cell power cubes, and then how would you associate with the electricity generation for that, which you I think touched on your general strategy, but hydrogen in manufacturing.
Yeah, so I only lightly touched on that. I do think hydrogen, green hydrogen specifically, is going to be an important component. We do have the whole fuel cell application. We did announce a recent partnership with Nel to actually get into to look at the electrolyzer side of the business as well, because it is quite similar to the fuel cell, just reversing of it. But for us to really address a lot of our scope 1 emissions, it is going to be figuring out a way, as we think about our science-based target, of exiting natural gas and either electrifying and or looking at hydrogen as a potential opportunity and segue for us. But it is a key part that we are looking at, studying intently, and trying to understand how will it fit into our operation, recognizing that hydrogen is its own animal, it being the smallest atom that it is. And as we look at natural gas, it requires a whole change of our piping infrastructure and everything else. But it is an area that we are putting a significant amount of attention to in order to elevate it both on the transportation side as we think about the fuel cell side of the business, but also something that we would consume as a fuel within our own manufacturing footprint.
Right. Okay. One, you slightly touched on ideas of geopolitics. This one's also related to U.S. context, perhaps, but question, how does GM manage the geopolitical sustainability risks? You referenced natural gas being more traded and all kinds of things like that. And then the follow-up here, it seems, Republican president, and then you get a Democrat president here in the U.S., and they have different views on, the future of energy. Anything you can say about how GM thinks about its strategy in this kind of context?
This is all really driven on cost. I mean, we obviously try to drive cost out of the business continually. And, as we look at renewables and as we look at wind and solar, they are the lowest cost source of generation, on the market right now. And regardless of political, aisles, we're doing things that drive our business forward and then make sound business decisions and have an internal return on investment, whether it's us directly investing into the technology or having a third party. In the case of like power purchase agreements, we don't own the power plants, but they're investing into power plants on our behalf, and we're taking the power. So from a geopolitical perspective, you obviously understand the global macro trends that are in play that, make the decisions that we do as we source, the energy that are needed for our sites. But as I go back, the key thing that really drives a lot of our deciding factor is it is the right business direction to move forward on. And one, we will address climate change, but two, from a cost standpoint, these are the lowest cost technologies that we're striving to secure for our manufacturing sites.
Okay, related to that, I'll skip ahead on one of these questions. You mentioned at least two different methods for sort of carbon accounting and sourcing electricity from the grid, to sort of 24/7 match hourly or sub-hourly matching versus emissionality, maybe more related to power purchase agreements. So, and sort of your goals, I think you didn't really necessarily say, GM is for one or the other. You said they're both great. Is there anything more you can say about how you think about your carbon accounting, or is it still, to be determined, or using multiple metrics? And
Well, I think one, we want to change the way the current carbon accounting is, because we obviously know that 1 rec equal to 1 megawatt hour isn't really necessarily reflective of the carbon content. And I think for our standpoint, we did join the Emissions First Coalition, which is really getting to the emissionality component of that electron at any given point in time. But it'll have a broad impact when you think about not so much our manufacturing side, but as where EVs can play a value stream when it comes to the cost reliability of the grid. They also, in effect, having a way to impact the carbon of the grid on a real-time basis. And so you're going to see us moving from an industry perspective, 24/7 is a definite right step, significantly right step into the direction, but we do see, the emissions component impact accounting becoming a key part of what we do, more so as we electrify the transportation sector.
Right. And related to that, is someone asking, sort of the question, or you plan on managing greenhouse gas emissions on a 24/7 basis? And I think you referenced adjusting facility operations. So, I mean, practically, I can imagine what it means for me, demand management in my house. I delayed my air conditioner or something like that, as you said. But for manufacturing, how can we imagine you adjusting your operations with regard to the renewable grid or the greenhouse gas emissions of the grid?
The bigger part to that is really working with our utilities on the integrated resource plan. So we have the data and understand actually what the carbon footprint is at any given real point in time to say, hey, utilities, as you're transitioning your fleets to a zero carbon strategy, what does it look like and where can we have the biggest impact when it comes to the renewable energy assets that they may be deploying in their service territory and or the renewable energy assets that we may be securing for our manufacturing sites within our own footprint. So looking at it from a kind of localized emissions factor, and then taking it up a macro level, thinking about some of these impacts that we can do as it relates to transportation and electrification. So there is a much broader macro view of these as we decarbonize the grid. It has a direct impact on decarbonizing the transportation sector, which has a much more localized impact on emissions, even more so than our own manufacturing footprint itself.
Okay. So is it fair to say you're kind of taking a big picture view to be part of whatever utilities planning process or anybody installing power plants more so than demand response at a manufacturing facility?
Correct.
All right. Okay.
It is taking the longer term view, but that longer term view is not that far out into the future.
Yeah.
When we really think about 100 years that these have been the way they are to potentially in the next 10 years, electrifying a huge part of the transportation sector.
Here's kind of a slightly different question, but more in the sustainability realm of things. Is there any plan for General Motors managing, let's just say, old internal combustion vehicles that might still be out there on the road, especially in maybe countries, Latin American countries or other places, as a transition to making more electric vehicles, in terms of maybe a take-back policy, or it's just like, okay, let them run their course of lifetime? Or is there any thought about end use or dealing with end of life of vehicles?
I mean, we obviously are looking at end of life of vehicles, but as far as managing or how the question is, that one actually is probably out of my wheelhouse of what I can, truly answer. I mean, in some cases it may depend on the country, and other cases, it's going to depend on products and services and things that are being offered. But I don't really have, not sure how, right now the end of life is obviously managed how it currently is, but it does tie back to sustainable materials and trying to ensure that there are ways to get this kind of circularity built into the products too. So I think there is a component of circularity that is becoming a big topic in the industry, and not just the automotive industry, but every industry as they look about circularity as a whole.
Right. Well, in terms of your, let's just say, low carbon or 100% renewable goals, I guess across all scopes of emissions, is there anything you can say about a strategy of, say, I don't know, maybe North America and Europe, which have a highly developed infrastructure, electricity wise, versus other places where it's not as developed and still developed? In terms of different strategy, where would you invest? Would you prioritize investing one place more than another from a big picture standpoint?
No, that's actually a really good question. I mean, in many ways, it's like how the cell phone helped in areas that couldn't connect from wires and copper and everything else. I do think electric vehicles in ways, if you have centralized type of storage or centralized, charging, that will have some impact definitely in the more rural communities. But I think as we look at investments, I think the bulk of it where we really have the largest part of our footprint right now, which is definitely North America. China is a large footprint. Brazil. I mean, those are going to be the areas that we definitely roll out a lot of our products and services. But I think the unique thing that GM Energy brings is it can go beyond just the General Motors product itself. It has an ability to actually provide services to the customer that, are really already in the house today and or transitioning as you get to smart appliances and other distributed energy resources within the home, that through a cloud, there's a lot more you can do to control that cost. But as a homeowner, you have very limited ability to access the market, and so how do you, that's the big part. But that gets back to the virtual power plant initiative too. How do we start to figure out how some of these distributed energy resources get valued in a way that drives us customers wanting to actually participate and receive something in return for someone else actually managing the way we may control some of the HVAC from a thermostat perspective to your on-site home residential battery storage to on-site solar to your electric vehicle.
Right, thanks. This one's a little perhaps off topic, but I guess it relates to your energy strategy impacting part of your whole business supply chains. This regards questions with regard to dealers, vehicle dealers. The person's asking, heard concerns the dealers might not make as much money servicing electric vehicles just due to the nature of EVs versus internal combustion. So Uh, anything you can say about any changes or anticipated changes in partnerships with dealers? Is this a valid concern that dealers might not survive as much, or might have to change? Is there, if we move to, moving to electric vehicles? Any comments on that?
I mean, you still have your standard, a lot of your dealership stuff right now is your tires, brakes, and stuff like that. So, I mean, you're still going to have quite a bit from a dealership perspective as well. I do think there's a long tail. Obviously, vehicles these days are on the road for over 12 years now, which is kind of phenomenal when you think about, the vehicles that are on the road these days. So this transition, while it's coming quick, is also one that will take some time to actually incorporate and get done. On the other aspect, gets into some of the services that we'll be providing from an automotive sector. I mean, the dealers are still a key component of General Motors and key component of the automotive industry. Really, they're the ones that are the direct engagement with our customer, and we want that customer to come back and buy another electric vehicle as well. And so we actually view the dealers as a strong asset towards our path to electrification, and working with them quite closely to understand the services that we may be offering as a company, where they actually play a critical component to be that intermediary from a service perspective. And so I see the dealers continuing to play a strong avenue, in that effort, because as I mentioned, they are the direct engagement to that customer, not someone from me who's sitting at, in Michigan working on energy strategy for the company. It's the local dealer that actually is engaging with that customer.
Right. Okay, here's one related to your, full scope greenhouse gas emissions. Your slide mentioned 75% of GM's emissions are in the end use or use of the vehicles now, because of, for the most part, combusting fossil fuel. So anything more you can add in terms of shifting to electric vehicles, in terms of that percentage going down or the actual quantity of emissions going down? Obviously, shifting to electric vehicles will make it go down to some degree with no grid mix, and then you're working on low carbon grid mix to take it to zero. Sort of, do you sort of envision, yes, the end use vehicle portion of your emissions can indeed get to 0%?
Yeah, I do actually see the ability to do that. One, I think you're seeing, generation after generation that's coming are very astute to the impacts of climate change, and we're seeing the impacts of climate extreme events on societies as a whole on a globalized basis. But I do see a path to get there. I think it's going to take everyone to really work collectively and closely together, because there's a lot of policy and regulatory work that does have to come with this transition from ICE to EVs as well. And obviously the current ICE vehicles every generation are improving from a fuel efficiency perspective as well, but working quite closely, and in scaling up the renewables that are already scaling to the grid, and utilizing the demand energy resources in a way that continue to drive that scale and decarbonize is going to be critically important, component to do that. So I do see a pathway to get there. It's going to take time, and it's going to take everyone really to work together across markets and across states to do it, but definitely see a path to get there.
Right. I guess in terms of your accounting, this is a follow on from me.
Yeah.
Do you try to count all the, all the GM vehicles that are out there, and they phase out at some time, internal combustion, and calculate those emissions, even as the fleet that you're selling at any moment might be a high percentage, the fleet actually out there is going to be a lower percentage of EVs, and you're thinking about trying to measure that as well, like how many GM vehicles are out there and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the Science-Based Target Initiative, they do require a pretty strict requirement to look at all of that, and we do have that tracking down to that type of a level. So it's out there. It's required. I think it's part of industry. I think it's part of the transparency of the industry as well. As we look at, that's why you have Science-Based Target Initiatives. That's why you have CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's really, these are all voluntary reporting, but if you're going to voluntarily report, you need to report to a common standard, and I think that's what, these initiatives drive towards, is ensuring that what's out there is the actual number that the companies are portraying and ultimately held accountable to.
Right. Well, as an energy guy, I can imagine liking to see a chart where it shows the age of the vehicles and emissions associated, all kinds of things. So that sounds great.
And it drives competitiveness too, because I guarantee you everybody looks at the charts and goes, well, if they can do that, why can't we? So.
Right. Somebody has a better chart. Yeah. I think you've kind of addressed this one, but I'll ask it anyway. You're talking about a pretty broad, holistic energy strategy affecting the company overall. So this question is just, more about how do you interface with the overall corporate strategy of GM, and what other kind of, I guess, internal organizations are a part of it. So, I guess there's a lot of energy and greenhouse gas emissions issues that are driving the corporate strategy. And then I guess we could think other corporate strategy things driving the energy part, but I don't know. Anything more you can say? It sounds pretty integrated, but is there's still challenges of integrating this across the company?
I think the key is really always continuing to think about how you connect the dots of a large company of General Motors. I mean, there's obviously, as you just noted, there are different parts of the business all over the place. And I think it's constantly connecting those dots. That's one of the things that I've done as it relates to the different parts of the business, whether it's the product programs, whether it's where I work within manufacturing system, sustainable workplaces. We actually do all the construction that overhauls all of these facilities and prepares them for electrification. And then they put in the products, they put in the equipment that actually then builds the products. And so I think it's that type of connecting of the dots, but having top leadership support that as well. And bottoms up strategy that, integrates how we can potentially meet some of these goals has been a critical component. I can tell you that when we took the Re100 goal forward, that was really one of our first, I would say, bold goals when we were saying we're going to establish and get this company to be 100% renewable electricity. Took some consternation in going back and forth on how we're going to do it. And I actually had to go back twice. The 4-pillar strategy really came out of that, because you got to give leadership an ability to understand there's multiple different levers they can pull any different part anytime that there's different changes in macro and micro issues that are impacting the business. And when you look at like a 4-pillar strategy, it gives both leadership the ability and lens into, hey, I can adjust any one of these and continue to meet our path. That may relieve pressures on one side of the business, but increase the ability to accelerate certain parts of the business and other parts. And so I think that's the key part that, as you bring up strategies, that you got to bring up, solutions that provide multiple runways to achieve the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve. And so bottoms up, tops down has been a great way to do it, and then incorporate that across the entire, as I mentioned, connecting the dots across the different parts of the leadership team. And a key point that I'll leave on that part of the question is highlighting that there are different parts of the organizations that might not think that they actually support the efforts. They do it in a very significant way. And I will say as when we bring a power purchase agreement forward for execution that supports our renewable energy goal, it's not just the organization that I lead that's doing it. I have to get concurrence from finance, accounting, legal, treasury. They're all critical parts of achieving the goal, and having them recognize that they're a key part of GM driving our sustainability goals. When in essence, they're a finance manager. They may think, I don't have any. What do you mean I have a part and ability to do? Well, you actually are reviewing the business model or the business, financials around this power purchase agreement. You're concurring that you agree with the experts that are bringing it forward. Your concurrence is required for us to execute the contract. So you, in essence, are an enabler to this being a goal to become successful. So those are the parts when I say connecting the dots, are traditional organizations that might not think that they're part of the solution. They're actually a huge enabler to the solution.
Right. Okay, here's a couple of questions, I guess, in the sort of V2G or vehicle to grid space. How do you really see the value of that to the customer? This question is kind of implying that this probably doesn't look like a good value to the customer in terms of wearing on their vehicles and what kind of prices they might get paid and this kind of thing. And in the scope of that, what are the plans for, GM's models of electric vehicles coming out in terms of being virtual power plants, as you said, or being fully capable of V2G and vehicle to home capability when they come out? Because I think right now, I guess, I don't know, speaking out of lines, if the F-150 Lightning, Ford F-150 Lightning is the only sort of vehicle to home integrated model out there right now. So what are the plans?
So the Silverado EV, so the Silverado EV, when it does launch this year, will have the vehicle to grid capabilities built into some of the models. I think as it relates to the value, and as it relates to, it kind of comes back to us. In the end, we are the ones that are going to dictate is their value associated with me wanting to sell electricity back to the grid. I mean, the batteries themselves, and as I think you look at the warranties and why GM Energy is into there, I think is really a moot point. We've seen that with the Volt and others. Those batteries have stayed in the market a long time with very minimal impacts to battery degradation. So I don't see a lot of concerns as it relates to that. As it relates to value to the customer, and like I said, we are in many ways going to be the ones that dictate that it makes sense for us to actually sell that excess electricity back. But I think going back to the virtual power plant partnership that we're part of, is markets need to figure out a way for customers to participate. Utilities need to understand what type of retail offerings that are out there, and ultimately to elevate the awareness to the public utility commissioners that there's significant value here, that we need to encourage customers to participate. So in some ways, it's kind of both sides of the equation. We will be, we're not going to be doing it if they say, hey, I'm going to give you 5 cents today for that power. But if you're told over the course of the month, you might get $200 or $300, possibly, you might go, you know what? If I look at my car payment and it's that, the value is going to be in how both sides of the equation really start to think about this as a solution to the markets going forward. And that's really critical, where the VP3 partnership starts to do all of that part of it, to start to figure out where can we enable the EVs as they scale up. As you noted, there's very few on the market right now that do vehicle to grid capabilities. There's a lot of utilities now that are looking at time of use rates and managed charging applications that help control some of those costs right now. But going forward, we as the customers driving the EVs have to see that there's a value associated with it for us to participate in the ways that I think the market can actually utilize it to scale up and decarbonize at the same time, doing it cost effectively.
Right. Here's a question about partnerships with other companies that provide, in this case, kind of home energy services. One of the previous questions about vehicle to grid and virtual power plants was kind of about Tesla's integration with solar panels, and this one's it's kind of a similar question here. Are you planning to partner up with big solar companies, something like Sunrun, to deploy residential services, or are you looking at local companies, or to do it in-house? How do you think about pairing the EV with other things that could be part of the house and sound like maybe a larger solution to a homeowner than just the EV or just solar?
Yeah, so we actually, as part of the GM Energy announcement, did announce a partnership with SunPower to actually start to integrate some home power, home solar solutions as well. So I do think you're going to be partnering with a number of various different entities that are really the experts in the space. And I think the part that we bring, obviously, is around the electric vehicle and the vehicle to grid application, and potentially some of the cloud computing services. But I do think it's going to take all, as we think about ways of decarbonizing, ultimately the grid and getting it to zero emissions. And, ultimately the markets dictate who's successful and who's not. Those are the things. You got to be able to be the one that, drives services and solutions that the customers view as a value to them in order for you to be successful. And to me, that's how markets operate. It's one of the neat things that obviously we have, but the flip side to that is we need to make sure that the markets and the offerings that are out there make sense for us to do, and the regulatory barriers are not in place. I mean, in some cases, for some of those vehicle to grid applications and others, you got to have smart meters. You got to have the ability to go back to the market. And so, there's things that have to happen from the process, and those meters are typically owned by the utilities. And so how do we get those smart meters installed and part of the process as well? So lots to come from the policy and regulatory front, but in the end, I think what we're going to find is a much more ability for customers to be able to control their costs based on how green the grid is, and ultimately how cost effective it is for them to do it.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Well, I'll follow up with maybe three more questions here, and then we'll let you go try to fly out on this wintry day back to to Detroit. So this question here, I hear you describe a complete ecosystem of General Motors cars, chargers, batteries, and virtual power plants. So the question here is about standardization and plugins and integration with different manufacturers. Do you see are the challenges getting solved in terms of plug integration and standard formats for communications and hardware, or are there still some challenges there?
No, you definitely see standardization. I mean, we can't have a different plug and different types of processes and controls in place, because it's not going to work for you and I and the customers. And so, in the end, we all know that various customers, I mean, from an EV perspective, yes, everybody's going to have the same plug. And I would say from a standardization, it has to be key too. From a security perspective, I mean, the utilities, the grid, the operators, the markets, the RTOs, the regional transmission operators, I should say, have to be able to see that. So standardization is going to be the utmost key in order to really address, because the RTO doesn't care if it's different automotive OEMs that are in there. They want to understand what that aggregated load potentially could be. And so you're going to have standardization
for
success. And that is happening.
Right. Okay. I think it's happening in time, and we're on schedule there.
Yep.
Okay. Good. In terms of this partnership with utilities, you talk about being part of integrated resource plans. Some areas there is no integrated resource plan, like here in ERCOT, to sort of be a part of.
True.
So do you find anyone in the utility space that is sort of disagreeable to electric vehicles, or does it just look like, more electricity to them and everybody's excited about electric vehicles, or are there some disagreements with utilities about how to do this?
I wouldn't say there's disagreements. You definitely have some very progressive utilities that are out there on a number of fronts because they see the value that electrification brings to them. And then there are other ones, I wouldn't say that they don't want them to come. They're just, there's over 3,000 utilities, whether they're investor owned down to some of the smallest municipalities and co-ops and things of that nature. It's more about, how do I ensure that I continue to provide the services that I need to continue to provide to the customers that are mine? And so I think it's not so much we want it to come, it's more about, how do I integrate it in at the time when I need to integrate it in, ensuring that I meet the needs of my customers? Because in some cases, the rural areas can be more significant based on how far the wires have to run from point A to point B on things. And so I don't see any real concerns. I think everybody's kind of on this path of, hey, this is what we have to do. Just some are much more progressive than others that are looking at it with a little more conservatism.
Okay. And this, maybe end on this last question here. A lot, talk about moving to electric vehicles. I don't know if you said explicitly. I don't know if that's 100% of the vehicle fleet by some time. And then here's the question about large vehicles that GM sells, Hummers, Suburbans. You mentioned coming out of your Texas plant. You see any conflict there? Or continue to sell the large vehicles but just convert them to electric, or in terms of serving customer needs? How do you see that? And maybe the phasing out of different models or converting to electric vehicles, or some be first and some be last, and that kind of thing.
I don't know the cadence of which we'll do it, but we'll definitely have vehicles of every size, no different than what we have today, from some of the smaller vehicles, that you see, to the larger vehicles, like you said, the Suburban. I mean, we've already announced the Chevy Equinox, the Chevy Blazer, and the Chevy Silverado will obviously be EV versions of all of those, and there'll be ICE vehicles of those right now currently on the market. And so I do think, we're going to continue to build the products that the customers are looking for, but we will definitely, from an EV perspective, build larger vehicles as well. I can't tell you exactly when all these announcements are. We've definitely made the Silverado. You can kind of imagine that the Silverado is on the same platform that Suburbans, Tahoes, Escalades are on. So you would imagine that we will go there. And then fuel cells. I mean, you have the fuel cell side of the business as well, and how that plays into some of the larger vehicles, as well as we go forward.
Right. Well, I think that was kind of a fire hose of information there, helped by the questions from all of you on the audience today. So thank you all very much. And thank you to Rob Threlkeld, Director, Global Energy Strategy for General Motors. Thanks for joining us on the UTES